P-51, paper tanks that broke Germany's last refuge. Berlin, Germany, March 6, 1944, 1300 hours, and Generalmajor Adolf Galland stood in the operations room of the Luftwaffe High Command. Staring at the plotting board that showed something impossible, American P-51 Mustang fighters circling over the capital of the Third Reich, their tracks marked in red chalk by trembling hands of the plotting officers who couldn't believe what their radar screens were telling them. That single-engine fighters from England had somehow traveled 750 miles into the heart of Germany, stayed to fight, and still had fuel to return home, while Reichsmarschall Hermann Göring burst through the door, his face purple with rage, demanding to know how this catastrophe had happened, how their last refuge, the deep airspace over Germany that had been untouchable, unreachable by any Allied fighter, had suddenly been violated by American pilots who shouldn't have been there, couldn't have been there, yet were there, shooting down German fighters over their own capital. The radar operators had first reported it as an error, then as a mistake in identification. Surely these were German aircraft on training flights, but the reports kept coming in from observation posts, from flak batteries, from fighter pilots who were being shot down, all confirming the impossible truth that American P-51 Mustangs were operating deep inside German airspace, and Galland knew, with a sickening certainty that made his stomach turn cold, that everything had changed, that the sanctuary of German airspace which had protected their industries, their cities, their entire war production, had been shattered by some technological development they hadn't anticipated, hadn't prepared for, hadn't even imagined possible. 6 months earlier, in September 1943, the situation had been completely different, when Oberst Hannes Trotloff, commanding Jägerschwader 54, had briefed his pilots at their base in Oldenburg, telling them with complete confidence that the American bombers were sitting ducks once their fighter escorts turned back at the German border, that the P-47 Thunderbolts could only reach as far as Aachen, maybe Cologne on a good day, before their fuel gauges forced them to abandon the bombers and race home, leaving the flying fortresses naked and vulnerable to the guns of the Messerschmitt Bf-109s and Focke-Wulf FW-190s that would rise like wolves to tear apart the formations. The mathematics had been simple, irrefutable, based on the known fuel capacity of American fighters and the distances involved, and every German pilot knew these numbers by heart. The P-47 Thunderbolt with its massive Pratt & Whitney engine could carry enough fuel for maybe 400 miles round trip. The twin-engined P-38 Lightning might stretch to 500 miles if the pilot was careful with his throttle settings, but Berlin was 750 miles from the American bases in East Anglia, meaning the bombers would have to fly at least 300 miles through German airspace without any fighter protection, 300 miles where the Luftwaffe could attack at will, choosing their moment, conserving their strength until the escorts turned back. This tactical advantage had been demonstrated with devastating effect on October 14, 1943, during what the Americans called Black Thursday, when 291 B-17 Flying Fortresses had attacked the ball-bearing factories at Schweinfurt, and the Luftwaffe had waited, patiently, professionally, until the escorting P-47 Thunderbolts reached their fuel limit and turned for home near Aachen. Then the German fighters had struck with coordinated fury, Jägerschwader 1, Jägerschwader 2, Jägerschwader 3, Jägerschwader 11, Jägerschwader 26, all converging on the bomber stream like a pack of wolves that had been stalking their prey. Major Heinz Bahr, leading 2nd Gruppe of Jägerschwader 1, had watched through his gun sight as his cannon shells tore into a B-17 of the 305th Bombardment Group, the bomber's right wing folding up like paper, 10 men tumbling through the sky without parachutes, and all around him his pilots were claiming victories, the radio channels filled with triumphant shouts as flying fortresses fell burning from the formation, 60 bombers shot down, another 17 so badly damaged they would never fly again, 650 American airmen killed or captured in a single afternoon, proving once again that daylight bombing without fighter escort was suicide. The Luftwaffe pilots had celebrated that night in their messes from Oldenburg to Wiesbaden, toasting their victory with French champagne, confident that the Americans had learned their lesson, that deep penetration raids into Germany were finished, and indeed the American 8th Air Force had suspended long-range missions after Black Thursday, limiting their attacks to targets within range of fighter escort, a tacit admission that German airspace remained inviolate, a fortress that couldn't be breached by any fighter aircraft flying from England. Even Reichsmarschall Göring, who had been increasingly pessimistic about the air war, had allowed himself a moment of satisfaction, telling Hitler at the Wolf's Lair that the American daylight bombing offensive had been defeated, that German war production was safe, that the fighter pilots of the Luftwaffe had proven their superiority once again, and Hitler had responded by ordering increased production of fighters, confident that the Reich's aerial defenses were impregnable. But unknown to the Germans, across the English Channel at the 8th Air Force headquarters at High Wycombe, American planners were working on a solution that seemed almost absurdly simple, yet would change everything, and it had started with a British innovation that the Americans had initially dismissed as impractical, even impossible: the idea of making auxiliary fuel tanks out of paper, laminated paper hardened with resin that could hold 108 gallons of high-octane aviation fuel. Colonel Bob Schaefer and Colonel Cass Hoff of the 8th Air Force had spent months developing these paper drop tanks, working with British manufacturers at Bowater Lloyd's of London, where skilled workers, many of them women, shaped craft paper impregnated with resorcinol formaldehyde glue around wooden molds, creating cylindrical tanks that weighed a fraction of their aluminum counterparts, tanks that could be mass-produced at a rate that seemed impossible for metal construction. The experts at Wright Field in Ohio had been scathing in their assessment when samples were sent for evaluation, writing in their official report that paper tanks are absolutely unfeasible and will not do the job for which they are intended. A conclusion that arrived in England after the 8th Air Force had already used 15,000 of these paper tanks without a single failure, proving that sometimes the experts were completely, catastrophically wrong. The paper tanks were engineering marvels hidden in plain sight, each one constructed in 3 sections: the nose cone, the tail cone, and the center body, all carefully shaped over wooden forms, with the center section created by wrapping layers of resin-impregnated paper around a cylinder, building up the walls like a massive papier-mâché project, then installing wooden baffles inside to prevent fuel surge, and adding the necessary plumbing and fittings before the 3 sections were bonded together in a heated press. The genius of the design lay not just in its simplicity but in its deliberate disposability, because the resorcinol glue that held the paper together would slowly dissolve from contact with the aviation fuel, developing leaks within 4 to 5 hours of being filled, making them single-use items that had to be filled immediately before takeoff and jettisoned as soon as they were empty. But this apparent weakness was actually a strength, because it meant the Germans couldn't salvage and reuse the tanks when they were dropped over occupied territory. At a paper mill in Bury, Lancashire, production supervisor Thomas Whitworth oversaw assembly lines where workers, mostly women whose husbands and sons were fighting overseas, crafted these tanks with remarkable precision, each tank pressure tested to 6 pounds per square inch, then given 2 coats of cellulose dope followed by 2 coats of aluminum paint, the silver finish distinguishing them from the gray metal tanks, though from a distance, from the cockpit of an approaching German fighter, they looked identical. By December 1943, the first P-51 Mustangs equipped with these paper drop tanks were arriving at bases across East Anglia, aircraft of the 354th Fighter Group, the 357th Fighter Group, the 4th Fighter Group, each P-51 capable of carrying 2 of these 108-gallon paper tanks under its wings, adding 216 gallons to the aircraft's internal fuel capacity, extending its range to over 1,600 miles, enough to reach Berlin and beyond. Major James Howard of the 354th Fighter Group, flying his P-51 named Ding Hao, on January 11, 1944, had demonstrated what these extended-range fighters could do when he single-handedly fought off 30 German fighters attacking a formation of B-17s near Ostersleben, staying in the fight for 30 minutes, shooting down 3 enemy aircraft and damaging others, all possible because his paper drop tanks had given him the fuel to reach deep into Germany and still have enough reserves to fight. The German intelligence services had been aware that the Americans were experimenting with auxiliary fuel tanks, but their technical experts had dismissed the threat, calculating that even with drop tanks, the P-51's fuel consumption at combat power settings would limit its effective radius to perhaps 500 miles, and besides, the Luftwaffe's own experience with drop tanks on the Bf-109 and FW-190 had shown that external tanks seriously degraded performance, making the fighters vulnerable in combat. Major Gunther Rahl, commanding 3rd Gruppe of Jagdgeschwader 52, had actually seen discarded drop tanks on the ground after American raids, metal tanks from P-47 Thunderbolts that had been jettisoned at the limit of their range, and he had reported to his superiors that these tanks held perhaps 75 gallons, enough to add maybe 100 miles to the fighter's range, significant but not game-changing, not enough to upset the fundamental equation that protected German airspace. What the Germans couldn't know, was that the paper tanks held 108 gallons, not 75, and that the P-51's revolutionary laminar flow wing and efficient Packard-built Rolls-Royce Merlin engine gave it exceptional fuel economy at cruise settings, able to cover enormous distances while sipping fuel at rates the German engineers would have considered impossible, and when combat was joined, the pilot could jettison the empty paper tanks instantly, restoring the aircraft's full maneuverability. Lieutenant Wilhelm Hoffmann of Jägerschwader 1, flying ABF 109G6 on February 20, 1944, during what the Americans called Big Week, had been vectored to intercept bombers approaching Leipzig when he saw something that made him radio his controller to verify what he was seeing: American fighters, single-engine fighters with the distinctive blue noses of the 352nd Fighter Group, circling at 25,000 feet over Magdeburg, more than 500 miles from their bases in England. Hoffmann's wingman, Unteroffizier Franz Weber, had laughed over the radio, saying it must be a navigation error. These fighters were probably trying to find their way home, running on fumes, easy kills for experienced Luftwaffe pilots. But when Hoffmann led his swarm into attack, the American P-51s turned into them aggressively, their engines roaring at full power, clearly not concerned about fuel, and in the ensuing dogfight, Weber's Messerschmitt was shot down, the young pilot's parachute, on fire as he fell toward the frozen German countryside. The reports flooding into Luftwaffe headquarters during Big Week were increasingly desperate, increasingly unbelievable: P-51 Mustangs over Brunswick, P-51 Mustangs over Ostersleben, P-51 Mustangs over Halberstadt, P-51 Mustangs over Gotha, the American fighters appearing everywhere, escorting their bombers to targets that had previously been untouchable, and worse, much worse, the Mustangs were hunting German fighters, pursuing them back to their airfields, strafing them on the ground. General der Jagdflieger Adolf Galland, trying to make sense of the catastrophe unfolding in the skies over Germany, had personally flown a reconnaissance mission on February 24, 1944, taking AFW 190 up to observe the American formations, and what he saw made his blood run cold: massive bomber streams protected by swarms of P-51 Mustangs, the fighters weaving above and around the bombers like protective sharks, some flying so far ahead of the formation that they were effectively conducting fighter sweeps. The mathematics that had protected Germany were now working against them, because with their extended range, the P-51 Mustangs could loiter over German airspace, waiting for the Luftwaffe fighters to run low on fuel and attempt to land, then swooping down to attack them at their most vulnerable moment, and the German pilots, who had grown accustomed to attacking unescorted bombers at their leisure, now found themselves constantly looking over their shoulders. Hauptmann Anton Haeckel of Jägerschwader 11, one of the Luftwaffe's most experienced pilots with 192 victories, reported that the entire tactical situation had reversed, that instead of the German fighters choosing when and where to attack, they were now being hunted, forced to fight on the Americans' terms, and the loss rates were becoming catastrophic, not just in aircraft but in irreplaceable experienced pilots. During Big Week alone, the Luftwaffe lost 17% of its fighter pilots, including many irreplaceable experten, the veteran aces who had been the backbone of the German fighter force, men who had survived years of combat only to be shot down by fresh American pilots flying superior aircraft with unlimited fuel, and the training schools couldn't replace these losses, couldn't even come close. The pilot training program of the Luftwaffe, already strained by losses on the Eastern Front, began to collapse under the pressure, with training hours cut from 240 hours in 1942 to 110 hours by early 1944, barely enough time for new pilots to learn basic flying skills, let alone combat tactics, and these inadequately trained replacements were being thrown into battle against American pilots who had received 350 hours of training. Oberleutnant Heinz Nock, commanding 5/Jägerschwader 11, wrote in his diary on March 4, 1944, that his squadron had lost 6 pilots in a week, including 2 who had been with him since 1941, shot down by P-51 Mustangs that seemed to appear from nowhere, always with altitude advantage, always with more fuel to continue the fight, and the replacements arriving from training schools were so green they could barely form up on his wing, let alone survive combat. The fuel situation for the Luftwaffe was becoming equally catastrophic, as the same P-51 Mustangs that were shooting down German fighters were also escorting bombers to attack the synthetic fuel plants that Germany depended on, the massive hydrogenation facilities that converted coal into aviation fuel, installations that had been considered safe from attack because they were beyond the range of fighter escort, but not anymore. On May 12, 1944, 935 American bombers, escorted by P-51 Mustangs equipped with paper drop tanks, attacked synthetic fuel plants across Germany, including the giant IG Farben installation at Luna, and the Luftwaffe, despite throwing every available fighter into the defense, could only watch helplessly as the bombers systematically destroyed the facilities that produced 92% of Germany's aviation fuel. The results were immediate and catastrophic, with German synthetic fuel production dropping from 92,000 barrels per day before the May attacks to 5,000 barrels per day by September 1944, forcing the Luftwaffe to implement draconian fuel conservation measures, including the surreal sight of horses and oxen being used to tow Bf-109s and Fw-190s from their hangars to the runway to save precious fuel for actual combat operations. General der Flieger Joseph Kamhuber, commanding the night fighter forces, reported that his crews were limited to one training flight per month, that fuel allocation for night fighter operations had been cut by 75%, and that some units were completely grounded, their aircraft sitting useless on airfields while Allied bombers flew overhead unopposed, the once feared German night fighter force reduced to impotence by lack of fuel. The Japanese military attaché in Berlin, Colonel Takashi Sakai, observing the collapse of the Luftwaffe with growing alarm, had cabled Tokyo in April 1944 that the appearance of American long-range fighters over Germany represented a fundamental shift in the air war, that the Americans had solved the problem that had protected both Germany and Japan, the tyranny of distance that limited fighter operations, and that Japan should prepare for similar long-range fighter attacks on the home islands. Indeed, the Japanese would soon face their own encounter with P-51 Mustangs equipped with drop tanks, when the seizure of Iwo Jima in March 1945 gave the Americans a base from which P-51s could reach Japan, flying 1,500-mile round trips that would have been impossible without auxiliary fuel tanks, missions that pushed both aircraft and pilots to the absolute limits of endurance, but missions that further demonstrated the game-changing capability that drop tanks provided. Lieutenant Commander Masatake Okumiya of the Imperial Japanese Navy, stationed at Atsugi Air Base near Tokyo, recorded his shock on April 7, 1945, when P-51 Mustangs appeared over the Kanto Plain, having flown 750 miles from Iwo Jima, the same distance as London to Berlin, proof that nowhere was safe from American fighters, that the sacred homeland that had never been touched by enemy aircraft was now as vulnerable as Germany had become a year earlier. The Japanese pilots who rose to intercept these P-51s found themselves facing not just superior aircraft but superior pilots, Americans who had learned their trade in the skies over Europe, veterans of the campaign that had destroyed the Luftwaffe, and the results were predictably one-sided, with Japanese losses mounting while achieving few victories against the nimble Mustangs that seemed to dance through the sky with impunity. Captain Yoshio Fukui, flying a Kawasaki Ki-61 Hien fighter, described his first encounter with P-51 Mustangs on May 29, 1945, when 517 B-29 Superfortresses escorted by 101 P-51s attacked Yokohama, the Japanese fighters outnumbered and outclassed, his own aircraft riddled with 50-caliber bullet holes while failing to damage a single American fighter, a humiliating demonstration of how completely the balance of air power had shifted. The Italian Regia Aeronautica had largely ceased to exist as an effective force by the time P-51 Mustangs with paper drop tanks began operating over Europe, the Italian co-belligerent air force that fought alongside the Allies after September 1943 having only a handful of obsolete fighters, while the Aeronautica Nazionale Repubblicana that continued fighting for Mussolini's puppet state in the north operated under direct German control with equally obsolete equipment. Capitano Franco Lucchini, one of Italy's top aces who had survived combat against Spitfires and Hurricanes in the Mediterranean, wrote before his death in 1943 that the appearance of American fighters with ever-increasing range spelled doom for the Axis air forces, that Italy's Macchi C-202 and C-205 fighters, excellent aircraft in their own right, were being overwhelmed not by superior quality but by superior quantity and reach, the Americans able to strike anywhere at any time. Back in Germany, as spring turned to summer in 1944, the situation for the Luftwaffe continued to deteriorate, with P-51 Mustangs now operating in massive fighter sweeps ahead of the bomber formations, what the Americans called ramrod missions, deliberately seeking out German fighters to destroy them, and the kill ratios were increasingly lopsided, 2-1, 3-1, sometimes 5-1 in favor of the Americans. The Luftwaffe tried desperately to adapt, forming heavily armed and armored Sturmgruppen equipped with Fw-198/R2 fighters carrying additional cannon and armor plate, designed specifically to attack bomber formations, but these heavy fighters were sitting ducks for the nimble P-51 Mustangs, which would pounce on them like hawks on pigeons, the German pilots unable to maneuver effectively with all that extra weight. Major Walter Dahl, commanding Jagdgeschwader 300, one of the specialized anti-bomber units, reported that his pilots were developing what he called Mustang psychosis, constantly looking over their shoulders for the distinctive shape of P-51s, breaking off attacks on bombers at the first sign of approaching fighters. The psychological impact as devastating as the physical losses, German pilots who had once been hunters now reduced to hunted prey. The development of revolutionary German jet fighters, the Messerschmitt Me-262 Schwalbe, offered a glimmer of hope, with its speed advantage making it theoretically immune to P-51 interception, but even these remarkable aircraft were vulnerable during takeoff and landing, and P-51 pilots quickly learned to loiter near German jet bases, waiting for the Me-262s to return from missions with nearly empty fuel tanks, then attacking them in their landing pattern. Lieutenant Urban Drew of the 361st Fighter Group shot down two Me-262s on October 7, 1944, catching them as they were taking off from their base at Akmar, demonstrating that even Germany's wonder weapons were vulnerable to the omnipresent P-51 Mustangs that seemed to own the skies over the Reich, and Adolf Galland himself, flying in Me-262 in the final months of the war, admitted that the jets were too few and too late to make a difference. The paper-drop tanks that made all this possible had become a symbol of American industrial ingenuity, produced not in massive factories but in paper mills and small workshops across Britain, each tank hand crafted by workers who understood they were creating weapons of war from the most unlikely materials, weapons that would help end the conflict by destroying Germany's ability to defend its airspace. By D-Day, June 6, 1944, the transformation was complete, with the Luftwaffe able to mount only 2 fighter sorties against the massive Allied invasion of Normandy. The once mighty German fighter force that had terrorized Europe reduced to near impotence, its pilots either dead, grounded by lack of fuel, or hiding from the swarms of P-51 Mustangs that ruled the skies, and Reichsmarschall Hermann Göring, surveying the disaster, reportedly said, "When I saw Mustangs over Berlin, I knew the jig was up." The statistics told the story with brutal clarity. In October 1943, before the P-51 Mustangs with paper-drop tanks arrived, the 8th Air Force was losing 91% of its bombers on each mission, unsustainable losses that threatened to end the daylight bombing campaign, but by February 1944, with P-51 escort available, losses had dropped to 35%, still significant but manageable, allowing the bombing campaign to continue and intensify. German fighter pilot losses told an even more dramatic story, with the Luftwaffe losing over 1,000 pilots between January and April 1944, including irreplaceable squadron, group, and wing commanders. The backbone of the fighter force shattered in just 4 months. Losses that could never be replaced, especially with the training programs collapsing and fuel becoming increasingly scarce. The German High Command's after-action reports from this period make for sobering reading, with increasingly desperate measures proposed to counter the P-51 threat, including suicidal ramming attacks by volunteer pilots, the concentration of all remaining fighters for one massive battle that might inflict enough losses to discourage further American raids, and even the consideration of negotiating a separate peace with the Western Allies to concentrate forces against the Soviet Union. Major Heinz Bahr, the same pilot who had celebrated victory on Black Thursday, wrote in his memoir that the appearance of P-51 Mustangs with extended range was the decisive moment of the air war, that everything before had been manageable, survivable, but afterward it was just a matter of time, a slow grinding attrition that the Luftwaffe couldn't win, couldn't even slow down, only endure until the inevitable end. The industrial implications were equally profound as German war production, which had actually increased during 1943 despite heavy bombing, began to collapse in 1944 as P-51 escorted bombers systematically destroyed not just factories but the transportation networks that connected them, the synthetic fuel plants that powered them, and the training facilities that provided skilled workers to operate them. Albert Speer, Hitler's Minister of Armaments, testified after the war that the extension of fighter escort to all German targets was the single most important factor in the collapse of German war production, that the paper-drop tanks, which seemed like such a simple innovation, had consequences that rippled through every aspect of the German war effort, from the factory floor to the front lines. The synthetic fuel industry, which Germany had spent decades developing as a strategic alternative to imported oil, was particularly vulnerable, with massive coal hydrogenation plants representing enormous investments that couldn't be hidden, moved, or adequately defended, and once P-51 Mustangs could escort bombers to these facilities, their destruction was inevitable, systematic, and thorough. The Luna synthetic fuel plant alone was attacked 22 times between May 1944 and April 1945, with P-51 escorted bombers returning again and again to destroy rebuilt facilities, a grinding campaign of attrition that the Germans called the fuel death, watching helplessly as their ability to power aircraft, tanks, and trucks slowly strangled. By late 1944, the situation had become so desperate that German fighters were being towed to their takeoff positions by horses and oxen to save fuel. A surreal image that captured the complete reversal of fortunes, the nation that had pioneered blitzkrieg warfare reduced to pre-industrial transportation methods, while overhead American fighters burned fuel freely, confidently, knowing they had plenty to spare. The psychological impact on German pilots was devastating, knowing that every mission might be their last, not because of enemy action but because they might not have enough fuel to return to base, forced to calculate whether to engage enemy fighters or preserve fuel for the flight home, decisions that no fighter pilot should have to make, decisions that destroyed morale and effectiveness. Lieutenant Gunther Schack, an ace with 174 victories on the Eastern Front, transferred to the Western Front in mid-1944 and was shocked by the difference, writing that against the Soviets a skilled pilot could survive, even thrive, but against the Americans with their P-51 Mustangs it was simply a matter of time before you were shot down, the mathematics of survival having shifted completely against the Luftwaffe. The Night Fighter Force, which had been Germany's most effective defense against RAF Bomber Command's nocturnal raids, found itself increasingly committed to daylight operations against American bombers, a role for which the twin-engine Bf-110s and Ju-88s were completely unsuited, slow and unmaneuverable targets for P-51 Mustangs that cut through them like scythes through wheat. Major Wilhelm Herget, commanding Jagdgeschwader 4, described the horror of watching his carefully trained night fighter crews being slaughtered in daylight battles they were never meant to fight, radar operators and gunners who had spent years perfecting their skills in night combat dying in seconds under the guns of American fighters that attacked from the sun with devastating accuracy. The Japanese observers in Germany, watching this catastrophe unfold, sent increasingly urgent messages to Tokyo warning that the same fate awaited Japan if the Americans established bases within fighter range of the home islands, that the paper drop tanks, which seemed like such a minor innovation, had fundamentally changed the nature of air warfare, making distance irrelevant, turning oceans into highways. Colonel Takashi Sakai's report specifically mentioned the psychological impact of knowing that nowhere was safe, that German cities which had felt secure hundreds of miles from enemy bases were now under constant threat, that workers in factories looked up nervously whenever they heard aircraft engines, wondering if this was the day P-51 Mustangs would appear overhead, followed inevitably by streams of heavy bombers. The Italian survivors of the Regia Aeronautica, fighting alongside the Germans in the Aeronautica Nazionale Repubblicana, witnessed the same destruction, their obsolete Macchi C-205 Veltros and Fiat G55 Centauros completely outclassed by P-51 Mustangs, unable to climb as high, fly as fast, or fight as effectively as the American fighters that seemed to appear everywhere at once. Sergeant Maggiore Luigi Guerini, one of the few Italian pilots still flying in early 1945, described his last combat with P-51 Mustangs as fighting ghosts. The American fighters appearing suddenly out of the sun, making one pass, shooting down two Italian fighters, then disappearing into the distance, no prolonged dogfight, no opportunity for the Italian pilots to use their skills, just sudden violence and death from an enemy that held every advantage. The paper mills in England continued producing drop tanks throughout 1944 and into 1945, with production actually increasing as more P-51 groups converted from other aircraft types, the workers, mostly women, taking pride in their contribution to the war effort, understanding that each tank they produced extended the reach of American fighters, brought the war closer to its end. Mrs. Elizabeth Chapman, a supervisor at the Bowater Lloyd facility in London, recalled working through German V-1 flying bomb attacks in summer 1944, she and her workers refusing to take shelter, determined to maintain production of the paper tanks that were helping to destroy the Luftwaffe, understanding that their work was as important as any soldiers, that they were fighting the war with glue and paper instead of bullets and bombs. The technical specifications of these tanks reveal the ingenious simplicity of their design, 100 inches long, 29 inches in diameter, weighing just 30 pounds empty compared to 90 pounds for an aluminum tank of the same capacity. The paper walls only 3/8 of an inch thick but strong enough to withstand the pressure of fuel and the stress of high-speed flight. The production process was remarkably labor-intensive, with each tank requiring multiple workers over several days. The paper strips carefully laminated, each layer precisely aligned, the glue applied at exact temperatures, the whole assembly pressed and cured before the internal baffles were installed, then tested, painted, and shipped to airfields across England where they would be filled with fuel and hung under the wings of P-51 Mustangs. Quality control was rigorous, with random tanks from each batch destructively tested to ensure they could withstand the required pressure, that the glue bonds were strong enough, that there were no weak spots that might fail in flight, because a tank failure at 25,000 feet over Germany would mean a P-51 pilot suddenly losing hundreds of miles of range, possibly unable to make it home. The logistics of distributing these tanks to operational squadrons was complex, with thousands of tanks stockpiled at each airfield, stored in specially constructed buildings to protect them from weather, handled carefully to avoid damage to the relatively fragile paper construction, then fitted to aircraft just before missions, a carefully choreographed ballet of ground crews working in pre-dawn darkness. Sergeant Donald Marner of the 357th Fighter Group, responsible for maintaining P-51s at Leiston Airfield, described the routine of installing paper drop tanks, checking the fuel lines, ensuring proper fit, knowing that the pilots' lives depended on these seemingly fragile paper constructions working perfectly, holding fuel for precisely as long as needed, then releasing cleanly when jettisoned. The combat reports from P-51 pilots consistently mention the moment of dropping tanks, that instant when contact with enemy fighters was imminent and the external tanks had to go, transforming the aircraft from a long-range cruiser to a deadly dogfighter, the paper tanks tumbling away into space, sometimes still trailing fuel vapor, as the Mustang suddenly became lighter, faster, more agile. Major George Preddy of the 352nd Fighter Group, who would become the highest-scoring P-51 ace in Europe with 26 victories, described the tactical advantage of being able to choose when to drop tanks, forcing German fighters to react to American initiatives, the Luftwaffe pilots often attacking while P-51s still carried their tanks, only to find the Americans suddenly dropping them and turning aggressively into the attack. The German pilots quickly learned to fear the moment when P-51s dropped their tanks, knowing it signaled the beginning of serious combat, that the Americans were now committed to the fight with full fuel in their internal tanks, enough to pursue, engage, and destroy German fighters before heading home, a luxury of fuel that Luftwaffe pilots could only dream about. By autumn 1944, the Luftwaffe was operating with only 10% of its minimum fuel requirements, forcing increasingly desperate measures, with some units authorized to fly only when bomber formations were directly threatening vital targets, other units grounded entirely, their pilots sitting in ready rooms playing cards while American fighters flew overhead unchallenged. The fuel shortage created a vicious cycle, with inadequate fuel preventing proper pilot training, which led to higher combat losses, which required more replacement pilots, who received even less training due to fuel shortages, a downward spiral that accelerated through 1944 and into 1945, until new Luftwaffe pilots were being sent into combat with barely enough flying hours to handle their aircraft, let alone fight effectively. Oberst Johannes Steinhoff, commanding Jägerschwader 77, reported that his replacement pilots in late 1944 averaged just 80 hours total flight time, compared to the American P-51 pilots they faced who had 350 hours minimum, plus the immense advantage of knowing they had unlimited fuel for combat maneuvering, while German pilots had to constantly monitor their fuel gauges. The impact extended beyond just fighter operations, as transport aircraft were grounded, preventing the movement of critical supplies, training aircraft sat idle, unable to prepare new pilots, reconnaissance aircraft couldn't fly missions to gather intelligence on Allied movements, and even bomber units that might have struck back at Allied airfields were reduced to impotence by lack of fuel. General der Flieger Werner Kripe, who briefly served as Luftwaffe Chief of Staff in 1944, wrote in his diary that the appearance of P-51 Mustangs with extended range had triggered a cascade of disasters, each feeding into the next, creating a situation where the Luftwaffe wasn't just being defeated but was collapsing under the weight of multiple simultaneous crises, all stemming from the loss of air superiority over Germany. The bomber crews of the 8th Air Force, who had suffered terribly during 1943, now flew missions with confidence, knowing that little friends, as they called the P-51 Mustangs, would be with them all the way to the target and back. No more running the gauntlet of German fighters alone, no more counting the minutes until escort had to turn back, no more desperate battles against overwhelming numbers of interceptors. Technical Sergeant John Burke, a B-17 tail gunner with the 91st Bombardment Group, described the emotional impact of seeing P-51 Mustangs still with them over Berlin, tears in his eyes as he watched the American fighters driving off German attackers, knowing that these pilots had enough fuel to stay and fight, to protect the bombers, to ensure more of them would make it home. The strategic implications were staggering, as targets that had been off-limits due to range were now vulnerable, including the Skoda works in Czechoslovakia, aircraft factories in Austria, oil refineries in Romania when they were still under German control, synthetic fuel plants in Poland, the entire German war economy exposed to systematic destruction by bombers that could now be protected all the way to their targets. The Wehrmacht felt the impact on every front, as fuel shortages prevented the movement of armored divisions, grounded close air support aircraft that might have helped stem Allied advances, and forced increasing reliance on horses for transportation, a return to World War I conditions that mocked Germany's earlier blitzkrieg successes, all because P-51 Mustangs with paper drop tanks had destroyed the synthetic fuel industry. Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt, commanding German forces in the West, complained bitterly that his carefully planned counteroffensive in the Ardennes in December 1944, what the Americans called the Battle of the Bulge, was crippled from the start by fuel shortages caused by the bombing of synthetic fuel plants, his panzer divisions literally running out of gas, unable to exploit their initial breakthrough. The Japanese military, observing these developments with growing alarm, began preparing for the inevitable appearance of long-range American fighters over their home islands. But there was little they could do, their own fuel situation deteriorating as American submarines sank tankers bringing oil from the East Indies, their pilot training programs collapsing just as Germany's had, their fate seemingly predetermined. Vice Admiral Takejiro Onishi, architect of the kamikaze program, argued that Japan's only hope was to make the cost of invasion so high that America would negotiate, but even he acknowledged that once P-51 Mustangs were operating from Iwo Jima, providing escort for B-29 superfortresses, Japan's ability to defend itself would rapidly erode, following the same pattern as Germany's collapse. Indeed, when P-51 Mustangs began operating from Iwo Jima in March 1945, flying those incredible 1,500-mile round trips to Japan, the results were predictably devastating, with Japanese fighters shot down at rates approaching 10-1, the home defense forces overwhelmed by American fighters that shouldn't have been able to reach Japan, yet were there, circling over Tokyo just as they had circled over Berlin. Captain Saburo Sakai, Japan's legendary ace who had survived the entire war, wrote that seeing P-51 Mustangs over Japan was the most demoralizing moment of his career, knowing that if American fighters could reach the home islands, nothing could stop the bombing campaign that would reduce Japan's cities to ashes, that the war was truly lost, that further resistance was futile but would continue anyway. The Italian pilots who had survived to see P-51 Mustangs dominate European skies had already learned this lesson, watching their German allies collapse under the weight of American air power, understanding that no amount of courage or skill could overcome the simple mathematical advantage of range and fuel that the paper drop tanks provided to American fighters. Maggiore Adriano Visconti, Italy's highest-scoring ace, shot down and killed in April 1945 while attempting to escape to Switzerland, had written shortly before his death that the war had become a matter of arithmetic, not valor, that the Americans had solved the equation of distance and fuel, turning their industrial advantage into tactical dominance, making resistance not heroic but simply suicidal. Back at Wright Field in Ohio, the experts who had declared paper drop tanks absolutely unfeasible were quietly studying captured examples, trying to understand how they had been so wrong, how such a simple innovation had contributed to the complete destruction of the Luftwaffe, the collapse of German war production, and ultimately the defeat of Nazi Germany. The irony was devastating, that while German scientists were developing jet engines, rocket fighters, guided missiles, and other revolutionary technologies, they had been undone by laminated paper and glue, by an innovation so simple that their intelligence services had dismissed it as impossible. Their technical experts had refused to believe it could work. Their fighter pilots had discovered its reality only when P-51 Mustangs appeared over Berlin. Colonel Cass Hoff, one of the developers of the paper drop tanks, visiting a captured Luftwaffe base in May 1945, found German technical reports analyzing recovered paper tanks, trying to understand their construction, proposing ways to copy them for German fighters, documents dated from early 1944 when there was still hope of matching American capabilities, before the cascade of disasters made such efforts pointless. The production statistics tell the final story, with over 15,000 paper drop tanks used successfully by the 8th Air Force alone, each one contributing to missions that destroyed German fighters, bombed synthetic fuel plants, disrupted transportation networks, and ultimately brought the Third Reich to its knees, all from materials that cost less than $20 per tank, a trivial investment that yielded strategic victory. By May 8, 1945, when Germany finally surrendered, the Luftwaffe effectively ceased to exist, with most of its aircraft destroyed, abandoned or grounded for lack of fuel, its pilots dead, captured or hiding, its infrastructure bombed into rubble, and its legacy a cautionary tale about how a simple innovation, dismissed by experts, ignored by intelligence, could completely reverse the balance of air power. The Japanese would fight on for another 3 months, but their fate was sealed when P-51 Mustangs began operating from Iwo Jima and Okinawa, extending the reach of American air power across the entire home islands, making every city, every factory, every airfield vulnerable to attack, the same pattern that had destroyed Germany now playing out across the Pacific. The paper drop tanks that made it all possible were never supposed to work, according to the experts, the engineers, the technicians who understood the properties of materials, the stresses of flight, the chemistry of aviation fuel, but they did work, perfectly, reliably, changing the course of the war, proving that sometimes the simplest solutions to complex problems are the most effective. General Adolf Galland, reflecting on the war years later, admitted that the extension of American fighter range through drop tanks was the single most important development in the European air war, more important than any German technological advancement, more decisive than superior numbers, more devastating than superior training, because it eliminated the one advantage Germany had possessed, the sanctuary of distance. Hermann Göring, disgraced and on trial at Nuremberg, testified that when he saw P-51 Mustangs over Berlin, he knew the war was lost, that Germany's last refuge had been breached, that the deep airspace over the Reich that had seemed inviolate was now a hunting ground for American fighters, and that moment of realization, that sudden understanding that nowhere was safe, marked the true end of the Luftwaffe as an effective force. The workers at Bowater Lloyd's in London, at the paper mill in Barry, at the other facilities across Britain that produced these paper drop tanks, had won a victory as decisive as any battlefield triumph, their laminated paper constructions extending the reach of American air power deep into the heart of enemy territory, making possible the systematic destruction of the Luftwaffe and the industry that supported it. Mrs. Elizabeth Chapman, the supervisor at Bowater Lloyd's, received a commendation after the war for her role in producing paper drop tanks, a small recognition for a contribution that had helped change history, and she kept one of the tanks as a souvenir, displaying it in her garden, this simple paper construction that had helped destroy the Third Reich, a testament to the power of innovation over tradition, ingenuity over expertise. The final production run of paper drop tanks occurred in April 1945, as Germany collapsed and the war in Europe drew to a close, but production continued for units heading to the Pacific, where P-51 Mustangs would need every gallon of fuel to reach targets in Japan, the same paper tanks that had conquered the skies over Germany now helping to bring the Pacific War to its conclusion. In the ruins of Berlin, amid the wreckage of the Thousand-Year Reich, German aviation engineers found scattered examples of American paper drop tanks, studying them with the bitter knowledge of defeat, understanding finally how such a simple device had contributed to their downfall, how their dismissal of this innovation as impossible had blinded them to the threat until it was far too late. The last Luftwaffe pilot to encounter P-51 Mustangs in combat, Oberfeldwebel Erich Hartmann, the highest-scoring ace in history with 352 victories, surrendered to American forces on May 8, 1945, and when asked about the collapse of the Luftwaffe, he simply said, "You could go anywhere and we could go nowhere," a succinct summary of how paper drop tanks had reversed the arithmetic of air warfare. The Japanese learned the same lesson in the skies over their homeland, watching helplessly as P-51 Mustangs escorted B-29 superfortresses to targets throughout Japan, the 1,500-mile round trips from Iwo Jima made possible by drop tanks, the same extension of range that had doomed Germany now sealing Japan's fate, proving that in modern warfare, the ability to project power over distance was decisive. The story of the paper drop tanks remains one of the most remarkable examples of how simple innovation can triumph over complex technology, how dismissed ideas can prove revolutionary, and how the extension of range, that most basic military capability, can completely transform the strategic balance, turning sanctuary into vulnerability, transforming hunters into hunted, converting Germany's last refuge into a killing ground where the Luftwaffe died.